Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Joan Ingersoll. I'm the Director of the Council on Aging, for those of you that I have not yet met. And we're really excited to have Barry Pell here today with us to present Antarctica Travels at the End of the World. Barry is a world traveler and photojournalist. He's traveled widely over 5 decades, visiting and documenting landscapes and cultures in nearly 170 countries on all continents. Mr. Pell has lived and traveled in China, Eastern Europe, North Africa, and South America. He currently lectures on international cultures at schools, universities, libraries, and community centers in the Boston area. Without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to, oh wait, one more thing. If you want to ask a question, he will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. But if you want to put it in the chat function, then we can, monitor those and ask those for you. Either way works fine. Okay, take it away, Barry.
Thank you very much, Joan, and welcome everyone to this photographic journey to the continent of Antarctica, where my wife and I visited a few years ago during our year that we were living in Santiago, Chile, and teaching English. And we felt this was a good opportunity to go a little bit further south and to visit Antarctica. Our journey was made by many forms of transportation, by ship, by small motor raft, by hikes on the ice and snow, and all of these brought us very close to glaciers, icebergs, penguins, and seals. And so in this program, I will discuss, first of all, some history of the continent's early discovery and exploration a little over a century ago. I will show you and discuss its dramatic landscape, the amazing animals that survive and thrive, frankly, in this challenging environment. For those of you who are perhaps considering a voyage there, I'll tell you how my wife and I traveled. And finally, and very importantly, I will speak about the environmental changes that are rapidly occurring on the continent, based in part on information we received from discussions with researchers at the stations where biologists and scientists are working on the continent, and how these changes, due to climate change principally, are thinning the continent's ice mass and reducing the food supply upon which the continent's life depends. The presentation is about an hour, and as Joan indicated afterwards, I certainly welcome comments and questions and any discussion about the continent. So I'd like to begin with a map of the continent to give you a little bit of orientation of where we were. So in this map, we're looking up at the bottom of our planet. The crosshairs at the center of the map represents the geographic South Pole. And you notice a couple of things. First of all, that there are 2 lobes, if you will, of the continent, East Antarctica and West Antarctica. And then there is this sort of appendix-looking 800-mile-long arm in West Antarctica, which is known as the Antarctic Peninsula. And it is that peninsula that most visitors to the continent explore. It also is the closest point to other continents to embark by ship to arrive at the continent. And so if you go up about 600 miles in this direction across a body of water called the Drake Passage, you'll come to the southern tip of the continent of South America. And that's the embarkation point that we use to access the continent. If you go in this direction, a little bit further distance, you'll come to New Zealand. And some people do access the continent from that part of the world. And then just for orientation, if you go up here, much greater distance, you'll come to Europe, and then someplace out here is Africa. So that gives you a little sense of what's happening, what the orientation is for the parts of the continent. All right, so let us begin. Well, at the dawn of the 20th century, there was a British explorer. We're very familiar with him, most of us are, Ernest Shackleton. And he placed an advertisement in the local newspapers. And that advertisement read as follows: men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, but honor and recognition in case of success. And those could not have been truer words. Well, since the time that Columbus set out for exploration beyond Europe, nearly all of our planet's land masses had been discovered and were beginning to be known. But the continent of Antarctica, much more remote, remained a mystery. It was shown as a kind of undefined mass at the bottom of the world on some early maps, and it was named Terra Australis, meaning South Land. That's all they knew about it. It was believed, however, scientifically, that this vast land on the southern part of our planet was necessary to balance the northern continents of Europe and Asia mass-wise, so that our globe would not go spinning out into space. Well, so began in the first decades of the 20th century what is referred to as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, of the planet's last continent to be discovered and mapped. Well, the men drawn to this adventure, and yes, at that early time, it was all men, although women have come to the continent to explore and be researchers since then. I'll speak about that later. But these heroes risked hunger and frostbite and even death. And what they were doing was competing to be the first explorers of this territorial frontier, the last one on our planet. And in particular, to be the first to reach the ultimate prize, and that was to stand upon and plant their nation's flag at the South Pole. Well, it would not be an easy accomplishment. And three names stand out among these earliest explorers. Their larger-than-life stories have come down to us as the stuff of legend and mystery, intrigue, and myth. I mentioned Ernest Shackleton. He did not get to the South Pole. He reached within 100 miles of the pole. He's remembered mostly for his ill-fated trans-Antarctic expedition when his ship, the Endurance, became trapped in pack ice that looks like this and was slowly crushed before his crew could reach any permanent land. And most of his crew had to camp out on the sea ice and frankly watch it start to melt with the warmer weather, while Shackleton raced for help, taking a few crew members and raced over 700 miles in a small boat across a stormy ocean. He ultimately did return with other lifeboats to save all of his crew. That's just one of the amazing stories. But the competition to reach the South Pole fell to two men. Their voyages occurred simultaneously. Representing the United Kingdom was the British captain Robert Scott. He started out a bit earlier, but his team was not as well equipped. The route they chose happened to encounter severe weather conditions. They frankly hadn't arranged enough provisions, and the freezing weather ultimately led to the suicide of some of the members and the death of the remaining polar group, including Scott himself. Well, a memoir of Scott's expedition, which is based on some of the notes that were found adjacent to his frozen body, which I highly recommend to anyone interested in a story of human stamina and determination tested to its maximum extent, is appropriately titled The Worst Journey in the World. And so the first expedition to successfully reach the geographic South Pole was led by the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, and he made that accomplishment in December of 1911. Now, he knew that this would be a very dangerous undertaking, and so when he was raising money to support his voyage, he actually didn't tell his supporters that he was going to the South Pole. He told them he was going to the North Pole, or the Arctic, which was much better known and much less dangerous. It wasn't even his crew was not told until they left their last port of call. Well, to the British, Scott's bitter disappointment, and as I say, we know this from the diaries found next to his body, Amundsen arrived at the South Pole 5 weeks ahead of Scott's team and was able to return safely to the base camp. Now, if the North Polar region can be described as an ocean surrounded by continents, then Antarctica essentially is the opposite. It is a continent surrounded by oceans. Antarctica indeed is the coldest, the windiest, and perhaps surprisingly, the driest place on Earth. Average annual precipitation is less than 5 inches, which all falls as snow to perpetuate a polar desert. Now, this may seem a bit ironic, given the widespread appearance of ice and snow, but the explanation is that what does fall stays there. So even a light dusting every year builds up over tens of millions of years. The result is an ice sheet that covers 99% of the continent, and in places is more than 2 miles thick. In fact, 2/3 of all of our planet's fresh water is locked up in this ice sheet on a continent that is about twice the size of Australia. The Earth's only other ice sheet extends in the northern hemisphere over nearly all of the island of Greenland. And this ice is not fixed, but it is somewhat plastic. It's moving. Under its own weight, the ice flows downhill in slow-moving streams that eventually reach the coast and drop icebergs into the sea. Now, Antarctica is also the world's highest continent. This was a surprise to me. More than half the land is over 6,500 feet above sea level. The ice on the highest peaks reaches nearly 15,000 feet. The continent also, unsurprisingly, has the most active glaciation in the world. Well, the harsh physical environment is plagued by what are known as catabatic winds. These are ferocious winds that spring up without warning and can roar down glacial valleys exceeding 120 miles per hour. Clearly, the wind chill effect can be numbingly serious. Now, the waters that surround Antarctica between about 50 and 60 degrees south latitude are affected by the meeting of the waters that come from the north, which are warmer and salty, these currents that come from the tropics. And they then meet the cold fresh water that moves north from the continent. Now, where these salty, warm, and fresh cold waters meet is known as the Antarctic Convergence. And it's the mixing of those two waters, the warm, salty water with the cold, fresh water, that provides the perfect environment for the massive production of organisms called plankton and tiny crustaceans called krill. And it is this food source, shown here, for example, in this man's glove, that nourishes a wealth of tiny plants and sea creatures, which then in turn become food to support the world's greatest concentrations of wildlife in the sea, on the land, and in the air. Now, our journey to Antarctica began in South America's southernmost town, the Argentine port of Ushuaia. Now, I've traveled quite a bit around the world, and my preferred form of travel is to be very independent and, frankly, to go by public transport. Clearly, neither was an option for Antarctica. Nearly all visitors travel to the continent by ship. Now, it's also possible, as I mentioned in the introduction, to visit from New Zealand, but the tip of South America is much closer. Now, tourism to Antarctica has changed dramatically since it began in the 1960s, when there were only about 60 visitors. The number of people coming to the continent has now expanded to over 50,000 during the 2018-2019 season. And with the growth of tourism, the embarkation village of Ushuaia in southern Argentina has mushroomed, and I must say, not very attractively, spreading out and up into the pristine hillsides with every form of sporting goods store, hotel, restaurant, and there's even, at this end of the world, a Hard Rock Cafe. Well, for tourists, Antarctica is accessible only during the austral summer season. Of course, their seasons are opposite to ours, so that occurs between November and March, during which time the sea ice melts enough to allow access to the coastal areas, and the temperatures actually can rise up into the 40s. They've been getting warmer each year, sometimes as high as the low 50s Fahrenheit, and even more importantly, there are up to 24 hours of daylight, which enables you to view and also to photograph. Now, during the opposite season, in the winter, the sea is impassable. At the area of Antarctica approximately doubles each winter due to the formation of sea ice. Well, our ship was this one. It's called the MV Ushuaia, the same name as the embarkation town. And it was considerably smaller than the behemoth multi-level floating cities, some of which do ply the waters to Antarctica. It was about 275 feet in length and considered a small size expedition ship for our voyage. There were numerous advantages to going in a relatively smaller ship. First of all, we were able to navigate with this ship into tinier bays and approach much closer to the land. The captain was able to maneuver for close-up viewing of icebergs and sea animals. In addition, our ship only took a maximum of 100 passengers. We actually had 88 passengers on our ship, and our entire group, therefore, could land simultaneously using these sturdy 10-passenger Zodiac outboard rubber boats, and therefore have more time to explore. If you have a larger ship, the passengers must go ashore in shifts, obviously dividing the amount of time available for exploration. Tourism in Antarctica is highly regulated in every way. Ships are restricted, as I say, to 100 people landing at a time. Passengers on even the larger ships that might have 300 or 400 passengers aren't even allowed to land passengers on the ship. They just do a sort of circuit on the water. Now, when I went on this trip, I had no idea what the passenger composition would be or the nature of the people who would go on it. It is rather expensive. I imagine these would be relatively wealthy people. They did range quite in age as well. The youngest was 7 years of age. The oldest was 87. So you don't have to be in perfect health to make this trip. They also ranged from 18 different countries. There were people aboard who routinely take such voyages, and others for whom this was an opportunity of a lifetime that they had saved up for decades. About a dozen of the passengers were American university students led by their penguin research professor, and that certainly facilitated a good deal of knowledge about those animals. During our 2-week trip, we got to know nearly everyone on board. Now, what made our onboard life so memorable was the always helpful Chilean crew, from housekeepers to bartenders, and the 6 Argentine expedition staff. Well, on our trip, which was considered an expedition rather than a cruise, we had a number of scientists and biologists who would give lectures to us each evening on Antarctic geology and marine life, and would warmly awaken us on the intercom each morning, both in English and Spanish, with a good morning, my dear passengers, and a description of the scheduled outings for the day. And here they are posing with us with our obligatory certificates for having visited the continent. There were 3 very ample meals served daily on board, including the occasional, rather creative chocolate penguin top dessert. Well, the names of the waterways crossing between Argentina and Antarctica and the designation of the various landforms on the continent have been named after the early explorers, and they're really a who's who of these discoverers in this part of the world. From Ushuaia, we first headed out through something called the Beagle Channel, which is a protected length of several hundred miles of water. The Beagle Channel named after Darwin's ship when he traveled through this area in the 1830s. And this, by the way, for reference, I'm showing you a replica of the Beagle, which happens to be in a southern Chilean town. And then once we got through the relative protection of the Beagle Channel, we had to make the most challenging crossing, and that was across a body of water called the Drake Passage. Drake Passage is named for the 16th century English explorer, Sir Francis Drake, and has the reputation, deserved, I must say, as one of the world's most notorious places for rough water. The crossing is referred to as the Furious 50s, referring to its latitude, or more colloquially as the Drake Shake. Well, our captain knew that there was a storm brewing in the Drake Passage, and he held our ship at the entrance for most of a day, waiting for that storm to pass. And the resulting crossing was still a little bit rough, although aided with certainly by seasickness pills freely dispensed by our ship doctor, and it was a manageable crossing. Now, there are many people who want to go to Antarctica, but who dread crossing the Drake Passage. And in the past decade, some tour companies have started to offer flights to Antarctica to bypass the water crossing. But weather conditions need to be perfect for that flight, since Antarctic law, and again, so many environmental regulations, Antarctic laws prohibit installing lights on the land for flight instrument landing equipment at the airport, because they will interfere with the behavior of the animals. And so you might have to, and since weather is notoriously cloudy or foggy, you might have to wait upwards of a week in order to make that flight. So you'd need to have a very flexible schedule. Now, obviously, as we started out on the water, we were all anxious to get our first glimpse of the continent and to step foot on it. But in fact, our initial encounter was at sea, and we were visited by a number of seabirds, including the Antarctic tern, shown here with its blood-red bill and legs, and the kelp gull, which is the only gull found in the Antarctic. And these birds would soar around our ship in the strong air currents as we got closer to land and dive into the water for food, mostly squid. But the most impressive bird that kept us company on this crossing were the Wandering Albatross, shown here. This is the world's largest flying bird. It has a wingspan of nearly 12 feet across, and indeed, albatrosses spend most of their lives in flight, gliding the waves and circling the major wind systems. Now, albatrosses are legendary birds, partly because of their great size, but also because they inhabit such remote and storm-ridden seas. And indeed, early 17th century mariners respected their grace and majesty in flight. They generally disapproved of killing them. They believed in part that the souls of drowned sailors were reincarnated in these albatrosses, increasing the fear that killing them would bring bad luck. Well, the lyrical ballad, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, was written by the English poet Samuel Coleridge, in fact, tells of an albatross that had successfully enabled a ship to cross the Drake Passage. And then after that successful crossing, one of the sailors kills the bird, after which the entire crew dies. So a lot of legend involved with this bird. Now, as we got closer to the land, we also began to see whales, these obviously enormous mammals, lengths over 50 feet, in pods of a few to over a dozen. Now, there are 7 whale species commonly seen around Antarctica. Among others, we spotted the Antarctic minke, the fin whale, and the sei. But the largest number that we observed were the humpbacks, a species, of course, familiar to us in New England. We were mesmerized by their behavior in Antarctic waters as they gracefully cut through the ocean at speeds of 15 miles per hour or more, blowing air in bushy puffs as they surfaced to take a breath, raising and splashing their tail flukes as they then dove back underwater, and occasionally breaching where most or all of their body would leave the water. Now, the most striking feature of the humpback whale is its extraordinarily long pectoral chest flippers, nearly a third of its body length, and both the flippers and the tail we learned, have these white or nearly white undersides, which are inscribed within a black outline. And this black outline is unique for every single animal. And it's like a human fingerprint. And as a result, it enables biologists to catalog specific individual animals. Now, humpbacks are untoothed whales. They feed by filtering the small plankton organisms, which I mentioned are so plentiful in Antarctic waters, through a series of mouth plates of tough material called baleen, which hang from the position normally occupied by the upper teeth. And so with an enormously open mouth, they plow through uncountable concentrations of this plankton and krill found in these waters, gulping and expelling great quantities of water while pressing their huge tongue against the roof of their mouth and swallowing their catch. Now, one aspect of feeding that has developed for the Antarctic humpbacks is a process of feeding known as bubble feeding, different than what occurs, say, in New England. And in this process, the whale will create a commotion of bubbles to confuse his potential food surrounding the body. The whale will be underwater. All of the fish and squid and organisms will sort of be trapped within a circle of bubbles, and then the whale will rise up in an explosive, open-mouthed rise to engulf the prey. This is known as bubble feeding. We observed it quite often. Well, of course, our ship captain, many of the passengers, all the passengers were interested in observing this whale behavior, and our ship captain constantly kept a lookout to bring us close to these whales, and an intercom announcement by the staff that whales had been spotted brought us scrambling over each other to the deck, cameras in hand, whether it was the middle of dinner or the middle of the night. Now, with 4 a.m. sunrises and late crimson red sunsets that filled the dome-like sky during the summertime, we fortunately had over 18 hours of daylight for watching and photographing. And then as we got closer to the pack ice and the ice floes that are nearer to the continent, we began to see other types of hourglass dolphins, for example, which would race through the water just ahead of our ship's bow, and the very distinctive dolphin, which we were very excited to see, these orcas with their strikingly jet black bodies above and brilliant white below. Now, orcas are considered the largest dolphin, traveling with great speed and in a close-knit group. They're also known as killer whales, although there are no records of them attacking humans or scientists or tourists, but indeed, and I'll speak about this more later, they are very strong predators against penguins, seals, fish, and on occasion, other whales. And so after 2 days at sea, we did arrive for a view of the continent. Now, tourist ships visit coastal areas that are ice-free during the summer months to enable landing. And our cruising area was along the small islands, the bays, and the inlets, which form part of that 800-mile-long arm of the continent that I showed you on the map in West Antarctica, known as the Antarctic Peninsula. And we cruised around both sides of the peninsula. Now, when we began our voyage, we had been provided with an itinerary of which bays and which days we would be in various locations. But certainly, even during the summer, when most of the ice is melted, it was essential to allow our captain a certain amount of flexibility, since we still could encounter ice that was too thick and dangerous for our ship to navigate. And so our captain did adjust our route and landing locations accordingly. And so arriving at the continent, we began a daily routine, which consisted of, after breakfast, going out in those Zodiac rafts and approaching different places on the continent and starting for going for hikes of 3 to 4 hours each, where we would walk along the shoreline or perhaps hike up to some snowy hilltops to get some magnificent views of the landforms on the continent. This was one of the steeper climbs. Many of them were not as steep. The snow in this area is crusty, but and we were issued special boots for climbing. They would usually dig into through the crust up to, say, our ankles or mid-calf. It was a little bit of a slog going up at times, but certainly if it may have taken us 2 or 3 hours to get up to the top for those views, it only took about 5 minutes to get back down, often using a much different part of our anatomy to do that. We also, there are some parts of Antarctica which still have some volcanic activity underneath the surface. And so these are areas that have stayed ice and snow free. And we would walk along the ridge lines of these volcanic cones also in order to get some views of both the landscape, the shape, as well as the bird life and the animal life. Now, our purpose, of course, largely was to meet up close and personal and be able to get to know, observe, and know the behavior of the two major land animals here, which are the penguins and the different species of seal. And you may know that there are no barriers or separations between the animals from each other or from the visitors, human visitors who come here. And so we were instructed, of course, that whenever we would observe a penguin, for example, proceeding from one point to the next, we would need to make sure that we always yielded the right of way whenever our paths might cross. Now, I've alluded before to the visiting regulations that are very strict to protect the Antarctic environment, as well as protecting the animals and to protect ourselves. We were issued high rubber boots and waterproof pants and life vests. The life vests were all numbered to ensure that we were accounted for on our return to our ship. Now, prior to departing on the Zodiac rafts, we also had to walk through 2 disinfectant baths with scrub brushes on each side to prevent us from carrying inadvertently any non-endemic microbes onto the continent. And this procedure was repeated when we returned to the ship. Now, between our times of going onto the land, we had time aboard. And that time, as our ship cruised around, was filled with breathtaking views of behemoth icebergs set against a backdrop of the mountainous landscape of Antarctica. Now, I had previously traveled in the Northern Hemisphere to visit the island of Greenland, and I had observed some large icebergs there, but the ones in Antarctica were truly mountains of freshwater ice that have broken off the glaciers or the ice sheet that covers the continent and were now placidly floating freely in the open water. Now, they typically break off of the ice sheet in a very vertical, sort of sharply demarcated pattern like you see here, but then immediately that they begin floating in the water, they are sculpted by wind and water erosion and melting that occurs in the strong sunshine. And so as we passed these bergs, each one was truly unique and magical looking. And here is one that somehow looked to many of us, curiously, like an airplane. Well, from a distance, a row of flat-topped and peaked icebergs might resemble the skyline of a small New England town, like some salt box houses, for example. Now, also, when the icebergs break off of the ice sheet, they are flat-topped and pretty vertical on their sides. But as soon as they begin to be eroded by the sun and by the wind and the water beneath them, they start to tilt. And often they will topple and rotate 90 degrees or even 180 degrees upside down, which of course makes a thunderous roar in the process. And our captain had to be careful about any mini tsunamis that might be set off by that rotating motion of the iceberg. Now, our captain also had to be careful about how close he got to the icebergs, because as I'm sure many of you know, when you see an iceberg above the waterline, fully some 80% of the ice is spread out and located beneath the waterline. And so in order to avoid any sort of titanic collisions, we had to be quite careful. Nevertheless, he did try to get as close as we safely could. And oftentimes we would pass a small iceberg or perhaps an ice flow, some ice just on the water melting like this, where we would observe one or more penguins who had hauled themselves out of the water during their feeding expeditions for a little rest and relaxation before they jumped in once again. And often we would see penguins, we would sometimes see seals as well, who were resting on some of the lower icebergs. Now, in addition to our land explorations that we accessed by these Zodiac rafts, we also sometimes made trips where we stayed on the Zodiacs in order to get up closer to the landforms and some of the bird life than we could with the larger ship. And we were able to observe nesting cormorants, for example, my favorite bird, which was the snow white sheathbill, shown here, and also some of the beautiful colors of the rocks along the land formed by these lichen and moss coverings. In addition, we were able to get very close to some of the towering glaciers that seem to loom above our small craft. And certainly in this relatively flimsier craft compared with our sturdy ship, it was a little bit intimidating seeing the edge of the ice that would be 1,000 feet high, towering basically right above our heads. And sometimes while we were on the Zodiac, we would be approached by a seal, like this spotted seal, who would pop its head up, curious to get a look at us. And really what they were after to know is whether a tasty penguin might be on board our boat that they could take advantage of. Well, in the distance behind our shoulders was our mothership, framed by icy peaks, looking majestic and a, to be sure, reassuring haven in the immensity of the continent. Now, you know, Antarctica, before the environmental regulations took hold and tourism became more controlled, Antarctica was visited by whalers and others who came here, seal hunters, for example, and there are still lots of decaying remnants of whaling ships, of canoes, communications towers, which is evidence of the presence of these humans during the last 100 years. Now, of course, there are no towns or villages in Antarctica, but the continent and its waters were plundered from the earliest days of world exploration for its natural resources, chiefly seals and whales. And from time to time, we would encounter the bleached bones of enormous whale skeletons that had washed up on the shore. But of course, despite all of this beauty that we encountered, the reason that most people want to come to Antarctica is to see a particular animal, and that is these penguins, observing these animals close up, these very cuddly animals, and their ceaseless activities, which involve so much constant activity to assemble their nests, to waddle, their nests made of stones piled up above the ground, to waddle skillfully, if perhaps not so gracefully, on their webbed feet as they would slowly make their way up and down steep hillsides between their rookeries, where they lived in these airy perches at the top of hillsides, and down to the water, where they would then wait and wait for the right moment. Often one goes in and the others immediately follow, and their efforts to then spend 3 or 4 hours in the water fishing and coming back with that fish in their throats in order to then go back up to their nesting colony, a rookery, to feed their babies with the regurgitated krill with the day's catch. Now, penguins and other wildlife on the continent are fully protected from human interference. As a result of all of that human presence, they have become, frankly, quite comfortable and habituated to the presence of humans. And so we were able to get within 3 or 4 feet of these animals. In fact, they seemed quite oblivious to our presence, going about their important business with the confidence that they've gained that we humans would stay out of their way. Now, penguins have been around for millions of years, and contrary to popular belief, only 6 of today's known 17 penguin species are found in Antarctica. Now, penguins are flightless birds, but in other ways, nature has provided them exquisitely with their ability to survive and to capture food in the water. They have amazingly compact, streamlined bodies with short, wedge-shaped tail for navigation, webbed feet, and massive paddle muscles that make them superbly designed both to grab onto rocky and snow-covered terrain and to swim underwater. Well, their stiff feathers create essentially an insulating layer of air over a thick layer of blubber and skin. Their heads can retract when they are swimming to create a perfect hydrodynamic shape. Effectively, their bodies are packed in blubber with a windproof outer parka. Despite average winter temperatures, which can get as low as minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit, penguins are able to stand for hours because nature has enabled them to adjust their blood flow to keep their feet a few degrees above freezing. And so we observed all of the industrious activities of these animals, walking, progressing by jumping from rock, tobogganing over ice and snow. Some must climb steep cliff faces to and from their nesting rookeries. Others can leap like salmon in order to land on ice floes during their fishing expeditions to rest for a time. On land, well, that's not their best surface. They walk upright with a seaman's rolling gait, but in water, they can travel very fast, careening just at the surface or diving in pursuit of squid, shrimp, or fish. Well, penguins move between their rookery nesting sites and the water along narrow paths that they have created with their webbed feet tamping down the snow. And these lanes that they are on, that they use for access, have been named by biologists as penguin highways. And I also found they to be very considerate of each other. When 2 penguins meet each other in opposite directions, one will very courteously step aside and allow the other one to pass. Of course, we humans were cautioned to walk on our own separate pathways up the hillsides and to not interfere with the activity happening on the penguin highways. Now, penguins are highly sociable birds, both at sea and ashore. They breed in colonies, which is one of the big attractions of going to Antarctica, to see such a mass of animals. These colonies can involve hundreds of thousands of pairs. The most common penguin in Antarctica is this one, known as the chin-strap penguin, because of this line along its chin, this black line shown here. And there are at least 8 million pairs on the continent. The chin straps and another species, the Gentoo penguin, shown here, make their nest from a slightly mounded saucer of small stones. And this occupies quite a lot of the penguin's time, because when they make this nest, gathering stones from a nearby quarry, they can only carry them one by one in their beak. And this seemed to be frustratingly slow from our human vantage point at least. The nests typically require about 200 or more stones to complete to make this mounded nest. And the animals patiently and tediously carry rock by rock. It's also very carefully guarded nest because of all of the work involved. Of course, penguins being like other sentient beings, some of them, if given a chance, will steal stones from its neighbor's nest, which often then provokes a very raucous confrontation. In fact, the nest building process, stone by stone by stone, seems so frustratingly slow to many of we visitors that some of us felt the urge to just go over to the quarry and grab a handful of stones and help out. Of course, our guide discouraged us from any such behavior. Well, penguins lay a normal clutch of 2 eggs between late November and late December, and both parents share in the incubation period of about 5 weeks. The chicks, as I mentioned, are fattened in their first months of life on regurgitated krill that each parent takes turns capturing on their sea excursions. Now, one consideration we had in when to visit Antarctica was when the birth of the penguin chicks would occur. And we traveled in the middle of January, shortly after the birth of the chicks, when to our eyes, they were at their most adorable size. At about 2 months old, they begin to shed their fluffy down, and it is because they have their fluffy down, which is not waterproof, that they cannot initially feed for themselves in the water or enter the water. And after 2 months, they begin shedding that down. You can see the beginnings of it here, where underneath is this adult waterproof coat. Once that process is completed, the penguins can then fish for themselves. And as adults, they grow to slightly taller than 2 feet in height. Well, despite the natural adaptation to the harsh weather of Antarctica, the lifespan of these penguins is only about 20 years. And in part, it's because there are so many predators, both in the water and on land. In the water, when they're fishing, they're prey to leopard seals and orcas. On land, there are brown skua birds, as shown here, who use their powerful jaws to carry off penguin eggs and swoop down to swallow small penguin chicks and drag away the larger ones. We observed adult penguins making noisy shrieking sounds to defend their nests whenever a skua might be circling or resting nearby to warn their neighbors of potential danger. Well, in contrast to the very cute appearance and busy behavior of the penguins was the presence, right in the same area, of various species of seal, including these enormous elephant seals, often found on the shoreline right in the same area as the penguins, with their somewhat comparatively unattractive torpedo-shaped bodies and more, it seemed to me, indolent lifestyle. Now, again, their body shape is not very conducive to moving on land, where they kind of maneuver on their bellies, but they are extremely streamlined for being in the water and for moving quite efficiently. There are 6 seal species living in Antarctica, including this one, the Weddell seal, with its smiling small face. And like many seals, the Weddell seal can use its strong flippers to then haul itself out of the water onto the ice to rest and then push forward on its stomach. Now, the elephant seal, shown here, is Antarctica's and the world's largest. The males weigh over an impressive 4 tons packed into a 15-foot length. And in establishing their territory, they produce a ferocious roar of impressive loudness, aided by the resonating chamber of their elephantine-sized nose. Now, when we were out on our zodiac rafts, our guides were usually pretty comfortable if inquisitive seals would nuzzle up to our raft when we were exploring the inlets and glaciers, but they were much more cautious when a leopard seal like this one would come snooping around. And that's because these seals, which are so called because of their spotted coat, have a reputation for violence and aggressiveness, and they have been known to attack people and even to puncture inflatable rafts like our own, but we did not run into any problem. When we talk about some of the human presence on the continent, about 30 countries maintain some 70 permanent research stations constructed on the rock and ice scattered around Antarctica. Their total population, which shifts between the winter and summer seasons, is about 1,000 permanent researchers there through the year, and which then rises to about 4,000 researchers during the better weather months of summer. And we stopped at a few of the British and Argentine stations. Their researchers were enthusiastic, clearly, about the opportunity, unique opportunity, to live with penguins as their closest neighbors. The staff, though, I must say, seemed somewhat delighted to have a rare visit by some human visitors as well. And by the way, the first woman in Antarctica, from a Western woman, was a Danish-Norwegian explorer who arrived in 1935. Now, nowadays, women comprise the staff at nearly all of the research stations on the continent, and some of them are very proud that they are manned by all women scientific crews. In terms of politics, no country owns Antarctica, theoretically. Activities on the continent are governed by something called the Antarctic Treaty of 1959 and associated agreements referred collectively as the Antarctic Treaty System. It establishes the continent as a zone of peace and science and is currently signed by 54 of the world's countries. And there are protocols on environmental protection, which sets out procedures for and obligations to protect the environment and its ecosystems. And these protocols also apply to tourism. At the start of our cruise, we were made aware of them and we were instructed about the rules for the protection of wildlife and the respect for protected areas and the research that is ongoing. Now, in international law, Antarctica is designated as what is called a condominium. And that means that many countries have agreed to equally share sovereignty of the continent and exercise their rights jointly without dividing the land into national ownership zones. Nevertheless, some of the treaty countries, such as Chile, as you see here, demarcates a portion, a wedge, if you will, of the continent, shown at the bottom of this picture, as belonging to the national territory of Chile. And they have reserved the right to make a future territorial claim. Clearly, it is a complicated issue. Now, also complicated and controversial is the impact of global warming on the landscape and the wildlife. Although the effect of climate change in the Arctic is very much discussed and in the media, and there's been lots of scientific research, the changes in Antarctica due to climate change is comparatively neglected or reported misleadingly. The science, of course, is clear. Climate change is already negatively impacting Antarctica. And in particular, the West Antarctic Peninsula, where we traveled and where most tourists visit, and especially the coastal areas, are some of the fastest warming places on our planet. The temperature has increased over 5 degrees Fahrenheit, for example, in the past 50 years. But since Antarctica is a big place, climate change does not have a uniform impact. Some areas demonstrate increases in sea ice. On this image, the areas in red have experienced a thinning of ice of up to 20 feet annually, but the areas in blue have actually increased in ice thickness of up to 3 feet annually. But the overall picture is that the continent is losing mass as climate changes. And in particular, where sea ice is decreasing, there have been measurable adverse impacts on the wildlife. Nearly 90% of the glaciers along the West Coast have retreated in the past 50 years, and this retreat is accelerating. It seems likely that the thinning of the ice sheet in the Antarctic Peninsula in Western Antarctica will eventually collapse entirely, which could raise global sea level by as much as 13 feet. Although scientists don't know how long this will take. It might take decades, it might take centuries. Now, in 2017, there was a breakup of something called the Larsen Ice Sheet, a floating piece of ice the size of Delaware that broke free from the east side of the Antarctic Peninsula. What remains unclear is whether or not this is a forecast of the future or an indicator of a phenomenon that is simply the result of localized warming. Indeed, marine fossils, mainly shells of animals without backbones and finds of fossil leaves and wood, have been discovered and show that during earlier geologic periods, the climate on Antarctica was actually much warmer than today. Antarctica once contained, unbelievably, extensive forests, as well as dinosaurs that roamed across the surface nearly up to the South Pole. The problem with trying to predict the future is that, firstly, there is just not yet enough data available, and the way things work is not fully understood. Now, Antarctica's only two flowering plant species that grow on the peninsula have spread considerably to newly available land, an indicator of the warming land. Certain penguin species that depend on the ice for most of the year have abandoned their nesting sites, and the krill that they depend on for survival has dropped significantly in some places, with stocks at least 20% of what they were only 30 years ago. Now, on one of the surprisingly warm January afternoons during our voyage, we returned from a morning excursion to amazed to find that a barbecue was being prepared for us on the outside deck of our ship, something we never imagined in this climate. Later, many of the passengers participated in a brief ocean dip, a chilly experience to be sure, but rewarded with major bragging rights of having swum in Antarctic waters. Well, a visit to the continent certainly left an indelible impression of the beauty, the strength, the power, and the energy of this continent, but also, of course, of its fragility and vulnerability. Moreover, the experience of viewing penguins and seals and other wildlife in glorious abundance within their own natural environment seemed to me so innately better than even the best designed, environmentally correct zoo landscape. Seeing these animals in this habitat imparts a sense of freedom, and lacking a better word, a sense of authority that these animals impart in their behaviors and interactions, which, even given the predators which are part of their ecosystem community, make their actions appear more uninhibited and genuine. And I certainly feel privileged to have had the chance to visit within their world. Thank you very much. All right, so as I said in the introduction, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself or you can type something into the chat at the bottom of the screen. The first question, a question I always get, is did I take all of these pictures? I absolutely took every single one of these pictures, with the exception of the last picture of me holding the camera, which was taken by my wife.
Absolutely fabulous picture.
Thank you.
Are there any emperor penguins in that part of Antarctica?
There are not. No. The emperors are mostly found on South Georgia Island, which is an island off the northeastern coast of the continent.
Can you say how tourism is regulated in the region?
Yeah, so I made some allusions to it during the presentation, but tourism is regulated from the standpoint of the clothing that people have to wear, to going through disinfectant baths, that you have to control any microbes that you bring on the continent. To now, in terms of the numbers of tourists, clearly it's regulated by how many permits they give to these ships that explore. And there has so far, they have allowed upwards of, I think I mentioned that there were some thousands of people since tourism began, when there were about 6,000 tourists there back in the 60s. The last couple of years, there have been about 50,000 tourists that have been there. At the moment, because there are so many sites to visit on the continent, we never encountered, it's controlled fairly well so that our ship never encountered any other groups. We didn't overlap or see any other people when we were there. But clearly this is something which, like many very popular destinations around the world, whether it's the Galapagos or Machu Picchu in Peru, these are things that, that governments will have to think about in terms of making sure that the adverse impacts can be controlled. But I think the approach now is one in which, rather than limiting the number of tourists, although that's done through the number of ships that are allowed to ply there, but what they're doing is really trying to limit the amount of environmental impact by enforcing many regulations for controlling how visitors behave when they are there, in terms of respecting the environments of the animals.
Considering the geography of the Antarctica, how much is consists of snow and ice, and how much is consists of rocks?
Yeah, well, of course, that varies considerably through the year. In the summer, many of the coastal areas, there is melting sufficient for people to walk onto the land. In the winter, it's pretty much all frozen in. The vast majority, I'd say 99% of the land, though, is covered with varying layers of thickness of ice and snow throughout the entire year.
Okay.
Question in the chat, the average temperatures that we encountered, and again, we were there in the summer, and the temperatures overnight might go down to the 30s. We were amazed that during the daytime, when the sun was out and got very strong, the temperatures actually rose up into the low 50s, and many people, when we were hiking up those mountains, would be in shirt sleeves. So a comment here, the fossils in Antarctica are explained by the tectonic drift of the Antarctica in the past 200 million years. Yes, that's absolutely right. Fossils, as I mentioned, have been found in Antarctic rock, and dinosaurs remains of dinosaurs have been found in Antarctica. But that it is true that is when the continents were still moving around our Earth's mass, and at that time, the Antarctic continent was much closer up to the equator. So it sort of makes sense that those fossils and animal remains would have existed in those areas. That is correct. The year and month that I took the trip was in 2018, January.
Your photographs were taken in quite beautiful weather. How often was the weather as nice as that?
It was probably in the 2 weeks that we were there. We were pretty lucky. The weather was overcast, maybe 2 or 3 days. Otherwise, it was pretty sunshiny.
Seal. Wow. How do you do that?
All right, anything else?
So how much in advance did you have to book the ship that you went on?
Yeah, so, traveling in Antarctica can be fairly expensive, depending on the, not so much, the expense isn't really based on what you see there, which is all pretty fixed, but it's based on the level of comfort and extravagance and luxury within the ship that you choose, and consequently can be anywhere, and the appointments and the accommodations that you might have, the size of the cabin, for example. And that being said, the cost normally could be, say, between $15,000 per person, upwards of $50,000 per person or more. Yeah. Now, however, these ships never like to go out with unused berths, and so there is a kind of last minute method, working through a consolidator that you can find on the internet, who will offer for companies that have excess places 2 or 3 weeks before they're about to sail, they will offer a reduced rate where you can save a considerable amount of money on filling those empty spaces. And that savings could be upwards of 40% of the cost. And that's what we did. Now, of course, to do that, you need to be somewhat flexible and to be able to arrange your journey somewhat at the last minute, but not in the last day. We were living in Santiago, Chile. Obviously, that made it much easier to get down to southern Argentina. Typically, the consolidator companies will provide you a list of possible ships 2 to 3 weeks in advance, and you need to commit at that point. So you have 2 or 3 weeks to make a decision, 2 or 3 weeks to get down once you've made a decision to that embarkation point. If you're able to do that, there is a significant cost savings for doing this. Otherwise, if you just do it the normal way, many of these cruises and expeditions are booking well up a year in advance. Of course, they haven't been doing anything in the past year.
Are there any health requirements to taking the voyage?
What's that? Yeah, that's true. They needed to have our blood type just in case of a problem. But other than that, there was a physician on board. Well, there was, yes, of course, there was a physician on board in case of a problem. The physician was certainly quite helpful for those people who went swimming in the Antarctic waters, who just off of my camera shot had an armful of big fluffy towels to wrap around swimmers who were immediately exiting the waters. But otherwise, no, there weren't any special requirements medically before we went.
How cold was that water they swam in?
Yeah, so the water, they went into an area that does have a little bit of geologic activity under on the land. And so when you first step in, the first maybe 6 inches or a foot that you step into the water, it's actually deceptively pleasant and warm. But once you get past that little zone and go into deeper water, the temperature were down into the 50s. And they were quite, not a lot of people stayed in for a long time.
Yeah.
So the tour company, question, did our tour company provide all the cold weather gear we needed? Yeah, many of the more luxurious companies provide you with these heavy jackets that you can keep. Otherwise, they all provide you with boots and special waterproof pants, which you then return. In our case, because we worked through a consolidator, one of the advantages of that consolidator for the last minute travel was that they also rented all the equipment. They actually gave us all the equipment they loaned it to us to use on the voyage, with the only cost involved is that we pay for dry cleaning when we return them. And that was a nominal cost. So how many days were we on the land and how many just on the boat? Well, other than the day and a half to 2 days, so a day and a half or so of getting there and then getting back to Argentina when we were obviously fully on the boat, every day we went onto the land. As I say, we had 2 or 3 4-hour excursions onto the land in the morning and afternoon. Sometimes we did not go on the land, but we just stayed on the Zodiac to see some of to travel to the edges of the continent. But we were off the boat quite a bit.
Huh.
They keep you very busy on these voyages. There isn't a lot of time to sit around. And as I said,
I would think that it would be rather frightening. I would think it'd be rather frightening to be in that crowded raft with the ice sheet above you and the leopard shark possibly coming by, I bet it'd be good to be back on the ship again.
Absolutely. It was a joy. You know, we had a great deal of faith in our Zodiac drivers. They imparted tremendous confidence that they had experience and that they knew what they were doing, and they didn't take any irresponsible kinds of twists and turns and bring us to places that we felt in danger.
Yeah.
But they were careful, and yes, for sure, when we were right at the edge of a towering glacier that looked for all the world that it was about to collapse on us, it was reassuring to look back at our ship and know that soon we would be back in the protective confines of its deck.
Yeah. Have they had any fatalities?
No, there have been problems on some of the cruises throughout their history, which have mostly involved the crossing of the Drake Passage. When the Drake Passage is very violent, sometimes people have lost their footing on the ship and have injured themselves, but not, for example, not attacks by seals or penguins or things like that. Yeah, and of course, right, that's another thing. Other ships, yeah, if there is a problem with the ship, they obviously are in communication with other cruise ships, and they can then come to your rescue. And that has happened occasionally with some of the ships that have lost power or gotten trapped in ice or some other problem that has occurred.
Yeah.
Did the penguin colonies or seal colonies smell badly? Well, the penguins, of course, have this kind of yellow-green excrement, which does have a pungency about it. But it's all in open air, and so we didn't let that discourage us from getting close to getting to know them.
Did life seem a little bland after coming, when you got back home after living on the edge like that?
Well, I don't know that it was living on the edge, but it certainly was a real great honor to be able to get an entree into their very unique world.
Well, it was exciting.
Yes, I
I imagine it's very silent there.
It can be, other than the noises of the penguin. At the rookeries, the penguins do make a lot of squawky noises in their communications and their protection against predators like the skua birds, and in challenging each other and making their nests, in feeding their young. So it's not completely silent, but to be sure, when you're away from the animals, if you're just sort of looking out to some of these enormous icebergs that silently glide their way massively but slowly through the water, there is an enormity of the silence that surrounds you.
Okay, this is Linda from the Carlisle Council on Aging. If there's any more questions, I'm going to start to make my closing remarks for Joan. Does anybody else have a question? No? Okay. I just want to say that that unfortunately Joan had to leave early for
Uh-oh, you lost audio.
Okay, I think I'm okay now. She had to leave for another Zoom call with the state, but I just want to say on behalf of the Carlisle Council on Aging, to thank Barry for this, wonderful journey to Antarctica, and that Barry will be with us again on April 9th for another Zoom lecture, this time with the Galapagos Islands. And so I hope you all will join us. If you'd like to do so, please register. Okay, give us a call or you can email us. And that's it. And I just want to say happy weekend and happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you very much. Thanks to Joan, thanks to Chuck as well for your help in facilitating this presentation. And it's been a pleasure presenting and sharing these travels to Antarctica. And I look forward to seeing you again when we can go to another fascinating place with lots of interesting animal and bird life.